Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. The ways religions and cultures are represented in our lives profoundly impact our ability to understand practices from around the world for years to come. Think about some of your favorite action or comedy movies from when you were younger and consider the ethnicity, nationality, or religion of who is portrayed as the villain or the outsider. For me, a distinct memory I personally have is from the Major League films starring Charlie Sheen, Corbin Burnson, and Tom Berenger. A character in the Major League 1 and 2 series is portrayed by Dennis Haysbert, who is now known for his recurring roles in Allstate commercials and also as Senator Palmer in 24 with Kiefer Sutherland. But Haysbert also appeared as the voodoo practicing Cuban refugee slugger Pedro Serrano in Major League 1 and Major League 2. In the film, Pedro makes offerings of rum, cigars, and more to Jobu, while other players on the team leer over Pedro's shoulder. In one notable scene, I remember Pedro and another player arguing over whether or not accepting Jesus Christ as Pedro's personal Lord and Savior can help with Pedro's ability to hit curveballs. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say the depiction of Pedro Serrano was my mental image of voodoo for my entire teenage years and likely all of my 20s as well. So how film presents ideas sticks with us. It sticks with me, for sure. I haven't seen Major League 1 or 2 since I was probably like 15 or 16, but I can remember it as if it was yesterday. That's how much film representation sticks with us. So I've wanted to discuss film a lot on the show recently, but film is sort of an accidental topic of discovery for this episode because I found my guest for the episode, Emily Cruz, to come on the show to discuss African religions and voodoo. Her personal interest in film, which she teaches about at the University of Alabama in a course called Religion Goes to the Movies, coincided and overlapped to create a fantastic discussion about Vodun, voodoo, African diaspora and religion, as well as popular culture depictions of voodoo in popular films. So Emily Cruz is a Ph.D. candidate in history of religions at the University of Chicago Divinity School and teaches at the University of Alabama currently. Her dissertation project traces the relationship between movement and identity formation in the context of Nigerian immigration to the United States, exploring the ways in which Pentecostalism conditions and is conditioned by the attempts of people to make themselves feel at home in a foreign culture. The major piece we discuss in this episode is titled, Is Voodoo a Religion?, which is a chapter from the book Religion in 5 Minutes, edited by Russell McCutcheon and Aaron Hughes. So we had a really good time in this conversation, and without further delay, I hope you enjoy my conversation on Vodun, voodoo, and the movies with Emily Cruz. Emily Cruz, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
It is great to have you here. Can you start off by introducing yourself to the audience however you see fit?
Sure. However I see fit. Well, I'm a PhD candidate in history of religions at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and I'm also a full-time teaching instructor at the University of Alabama in the Religious Studies department. I should say roll tide. Roll tide. I guess if I'm allowed to call myself a scholar, maybe I would say, as a scholar, my interests are in big questions about how religion shapes who we are and who we think we're supposed to be, how do personal and institutional group identities come out of or relate to religion. And a lot of the work I'm doing right now is trying to answer those questions by thinking through religion in African diasporic communities in the U.S., specifically Pentecostal Christianity, Nigerian Pentecostal Christianity in Chicago.
Nice. I'm curious just real quick about the how you're managing with that distance between Chicago and Alabama at the moment while you're finishing up your program while also teaching. How's that going?
That's a good question. It's better on some days than on others. Certainly the kind of strange pandemic situation we're in right now has made it more difficult. But it's a lot of work. But for me, teaching really kind of fires my research brain and vice versa. So it's a lot of work, but it's exciting work to be doing.
Nice. Okay, so I'm always curious about people's backstories a little bit. How did you come to care about the academic study of religion as like a career path? What was that process, that meandering process like to lead you to where you are today?
It was definitely meandering. That's a good word for it. I grew up in the American South, in South Carolina, and I think from as early as I can remember, the way that people talked about themselves and who they were supposed to be and who they wanted to be and the kinds of things they could do and couldn't do, like, dance or drink wine, who they could love, all these sorts of things were informed or shaped by recourse to religion, Christianity specifically for most people. And so, from as early as I can remember, religion was part of how people talked about themselves. And I think that really just stuck with me, probably subconsciously for a long time. So that, by the time I was in high school, I had all these questions about like why this or why that didn't feel fully answered by, a sort of insider religious account of things. And so when I went to college, I was interested in a lot of stuff, but religious studies kept sort of calling me back. And Agnes Scott College, where I went to do my undergrad, has a really great religious studies program and history program. And so a lot of the people I spent time talking to or took classes with really helped me think in this academic way about what on earth religion is and why it works the way it does. And then I did Peace Corps in Southern Africa, and a lot of the same questions I'd had from growing up and in college pertained and were relevant there also. And so I kind of just kept having this, this persistent heartbeat of questions, why this, why that, what about that? And when I finished Peace Corps, someone let me into the master's program at the Divinity school at Chicago. And I was hooked from there. I loved the kinds of critical, theoretically driven questions that were being asked in the history of religions subfield. And I've been there in some capacity or another, maybe not physically, since then.
Was the Peace Corps your sort of intro to being interested in African diaspora, migration, et cetera, that finds its way into your work now?
It was not, actually, although it was a particular stage of it. I've actually been interested in Africa also since I was a kid. Growing up as a white child in the South, I heard Africa talked about in these really different and in some ways kind of opposing ways. And, for some people, Africa was just this place of hope and inspiration, a homeland, a kind of root of tradition. And for others, namely white people, it was used as a tool to dismiss people of color and a way to kind of denigrate tradition that African Americans especially were claiming. And so that really stuck with me as this, it can't be both. There's got to be something wrong here. Or could it be both, and why? And when I got to college, I had, again, these amazing professors, Tina Pippin and Mary Kane and Violet Johnson, historians and scholars of religion, who helped me really think about how discourse was used, why people might, want to construct this sort of ideological image of Africa as negative and backward, et cetera, and why they'd want to kind of take that away from people, what kind of ideological ends that would serve. And I think that theoretical thinking, I was just so lucky to have these professors who helped me systematically figure out what's the motivation here? Why do people do it? What's wrong with it? How do you work against it? And how does that, can you do that in a principled way in your scholarship? And then, I was taking classes about the Old Testament, as it was called at Agnes Scott, the Hebrew Bible, antebellum America, colonial and post-colonial West Africa. And so all that stuff actually really merged and brought me into this way of thinking about what does religion have to do, or can it have to do with the way that we think about designations like African or African Christianity or whatever. And then Peace Corps, I was in Southern Africa, which is actually in many ways very different from West Africa, and in others not so much. And so it was this other new way of thinking about Africa and living and being. And so for me, my interest in Africa and in the diaspora doesn't come from a personal one, in the sense of like, I don't know what it means to claim that identity or to have an experience that is African or African American or part of a diaspora in that sense. But I think I just really came to see this like dignity and beauty in the way that people thought about Africa, and Peace Corps really, I think, just hammered that home.
Awesome. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about teaching and a little bit of writing today. And so you and I connected on Twitter, I guess it was several months ago, and we've been trying to make this, get our schedules to align now for a while to get you on the show. But something that I found whenever I was looking into some of your work the other day is that you teach a class which sounds so cool. And I'm a high school teacher, so I get super geeky about people's course selections, like what they teach, what materials they use, and how they tie in different cultural attributes. And you have a class called Religion Goes to the Movies, which I feel does all of that, because it sounds like you have a fantastic array of engaging pop culture, stereotype busting exercises and class discussions, and like a complete, almost like a reframing for the way that young people might come to see religions different than the ones they personally have practiced. So I would love to know a little bit about how you set up and organize this class, like what the order of the class is, and just, about the organization in general.
Yeah. Man, I hope that's true of my teaching. I love the idea of being a stereotype busting teacher.
I believe it probably is. It probably does.
Let's hope so. So this class is really interesting for a variety of reasons. It was created and put, on the books and on the schedule well before I ever got to UA. The department here is really creative and forward thinking, and it's part of what drew me to it, about how to engage students and how to sort of take some of this theoretical stuff we're doing in our scholarship and translate it into classes. So this one is a bit interesting because it's actually only a 1 credit hour class. So it's not like your standard, seminar or lecture class or whatever. And so the idea is less necessarily that you choose movies that are explicitly like about religion, and we can think of probably hundreds of those. And rather that what we're doing in the class is trying to show students who probably have never taken a religious studies class. I mean, that's true of the vast majority of the students, and who may never take another one, especially if they don't like this one. Trying to show them how we can use the sort of methods and skills we gain from studying religion to think about things that aren't necessarily explicitly about religion, which I think is really like under the core of all my teaching, which is trying to teach students, you don't necessarily have to be thinking about religion and, problematizing what that even means, right? But you don't have to be thinking about religion per se, however you define it, to be using skills that religious studies can teach you. You can use those skills to think about anything. And so the class is taking movies that I wanted to watch or that I thought were illustrative of a concept or whatever, and trying to do that. So every semester, this is only my 4th semester, so my 2nd year, but for the 4 semesters, I've chosen some kind of theme that I thought was interesting, or as the class has grown and more students have taken it, I've started just polling the students. Look, here are 3 themes. What do you think? Send me an email if you have a strong feeling about something. Trying to, in a way, start off from the very beginning before we even get into class, saying, like, this class belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. Weigh in. And then we pick a theme, and then I pick a series of movies and let them weigh in on those. So the first semester, the theme was coming of age, and we watched The Hunger Games, Dope, Lady Bird, and Call Me by Your Name. And then we've watched, other things since then. So what the other themes have been The End of the World as We Know It, which, seems kind of prescient now.
Oh, yes.
And a number of my students, that was last semester, a number of my students have emailed them and been like, oh, this class really helped me prepare. Both funny and really depressing. This semester we did Other Beings, Other Worlds. So trying to think about what does it mean to posit the existence of beings other than humans? What's the ideological work done by an assumption of that kind? And so we watched The Witch, which, freaked out everyone and was awesome to talk about. We were all like, oh, when we went home, and Arrival, and, we got interrupted, so we didn't get to watch the rest of the movies together. But it has been one of the most fun things I've ever taught. The students get so excited, and, I think they're, in a way, really sophisticated when it comes to talking about movies because they've been watching them and thinking about them their whole lives. But in another way, they aren't really taught to, criticize and look for underlying themes or see where characters are symbols and that kind of thing. That's stuff they do in like an English class or, whatever. So teaching them how you can look at a story like The Witch and see stuff like, fear of nature, the distinction between nature and humanity, a distinction between masculine and feminine, fear of the feminine is wild or whatever. And seeing them, literally seeing their faces, but also looking at what they write and seeing this transition where they're like, cool, movies are fun. And then like, my brain is broken because, and they are so good at it. They're so good. So yeah, it's super fun. And I feel really lucky that UA, that the Religious Studies Department gave me this course because I feel in a way like it has been some of the most instructive teaching for me because I'm dealing with so many different students from different backgrounds and trying to convince them like, no, this movie really might be about 9/11, guys, really.
Well, and I also think that something that if I'm thinking about myself as a learner, a class like that would help me to see cultural illusions that people in society make all around me that are tied or inspired by religion in some way, but if I don't know the cultural touchstones, I can't make those connections. So I kind of feel like you bringing those themes to the front will help students see those when they come out in their life after your class.
Yeah, for sure. That's the hope, right? That they are able to see like, look, this story, about a guy who's all by himself walking through the desert, like, there are lots of, other stories like that this might be drawing on, or, you able to see sort of mythological allusions or like people, this story was stolen from Homer, or not stolen, like borrowed from or inspired by or whatever. Right. So it's really fun to see them figuring out that stuff and also to see them bringing their own things to it. So things that would never have occurred to me because they're 18 or 20 and they're steeped in this kind of knowledge or culture that like, it's just not mine anymore because, I'm old. And so it's really like has changed also the way that I look at things and read things. It's so much fun.
It helps you reframe from a younger perspective. And so that way you can have your experience of being, older, like however old you are, but then also thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who might be like, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years younger than you, So it keeps you thinking about things in a diverse way so that you can see multiple perspectives. That's why I think that teaching is such a powerful profession in general.
Yeah, it really has, as much as people joke like, oh, they keep me young. I think I've resisted saying that in part just because it's such a, common thing to say. Sure. But in a way, there is something about, if nothing else, exposure to ways of thinking and data for thinking that I don't have the same kind of fluency in. And so having them teach me about the number of things, I feel like my classes, if nothing else, I make so many notes because they've taught me about iCarly and Phineas and Ferb and, all these things, TikTok. I've learned to call them TikToks, not TikTok videos, because they mocked me aggressively as they should. So things like that, I think, as much as often professors want to dismiss that sort of thing as like, oh, that's just pop culture. Actually, it's, this incredibly compelling data for how we think and how we talk. And it's been really useful to me. They've changed the way I think, no doubt.
I love it. Well, we're going to come back to films in a little bit through a couple of examples that I've pulled out from some of your work, but I read a piece of yours recently called Is Voodoo a Religion? So I want to go back to your African diaspora interests, and then we're going to come back and tie in the pop culture here in a little bit. But I have many questions about this piece, but I want to begin with terminology and about the two voodoos that you describe in the piece. One is a depiction of colonialist attempts to foster a sense of superiority of one group against another, and the other voodoo, an actual belief system and practices that emerge out of the interaction of African, Native American, and European religions in the Caribbean and the United States. So, as complicated a question as this might be, I'm wondering if you can distinguish between the two voodoos in a bit of detail for me so the terminology is crystal clear and that these are distinguished for the listener. So Let's start with voodoo, the phenomenon invented out of a racist fantasy about African people. Can you describe what that is a bit?
Sure. So yes, religious studies, scholars, we love things to be about as clear as mud. So I will do my best. Let me first start by saying, though, that I am not a specialist on this topic. There are so many scholars who can talk about this better and more elegantly than I can. They've already done it. But I'll tell you my take on it, and we can kind of go from there. So the way I framed the article was trying to think about why it is. So let me actually just say the article is in a book called Religion in 5 Minutes, edited by Aaron Hughes and Russell McCutcheon, which is geared toward an undergraduate audience. So the idea is the articles we wrote were we sort of framed on a question. So mine is voodoo a religion? That we're supposed to help undergrads kind of think critically about stuff, religious studies related. So in part, I asked the question because all the time I feel like my students and other people I've heard, like my whole life, well, voodoo is not a religion, right? This VOODOO isn't a religion. And so I wanted to say, why do people say that? What do they mean by religion, et cetera? So when I proposed this term, VOODOO, what I was, started by talking about, as you said, this kind of racist fantasy, is that often when the term is used, what it means is something like, backward, evil, magic related stuff that we would never, right, when we use the word religion. To be clear, that's not me talking, but other people talking. And the term, I think, often is sort of tied into this exoticization, sexualization, sensationalist perspective of African diaspora religions. Not just in Haiti, where Vodun, which we'll talk about in a minute, actually, comes from, but also just sort of in the U.S. and New Orleans, et cetera. So I think there's this way of linking the notion of Blackness or Black religion with a capital B, African diasporal religions with, the suspicious, the mysterious, the dangerous, the compelling, but in a way that, you might get burned. And so in the article, I was trying to make this argument that often when we talk about voodoo in a colloquial sense in the United States, that's what people are looking at. And that the origins of that are from, a white, Western, European and American colonial perspective of, in this case, Haiti and the Caribbean, that says, these people who are different from us racially, we're going to, sort of have use this religion or use these set of practices or ideas as a way of distinguishing ourselves from them, our rational, compelling, non-magic believing selves from this kind of fantastical world.
Okay. So then we have, as you mentioned a minute ago, the term Vodun. What is this? VODUN. What is that?
Yeah, so it's spelled in other ways too. So I should say that. I can't remember now if I said that in the article or not. I think I did. So there's, there are all kinds of ways of spelling it. But yes, VODON or UN or VODOUN. Okay. I'm trying to think about how to do this as systematically as possible. There's VOODOO, this thing that gets sensationalized or exoticized that comes out of the Caribbean, especially Haiti. And it is that sensationalized thing is based on some things that actually exist in Haiti called Haitian Vodun. And that Haitian Vodun comes out of a really fascinating interaction between a variety of traditions. So first, and probably the main one where the term comes from, is Vodun, which comes from West Africa. So it came at the time in the 18th and 19th centuries from what is now Benin and Nigeria and Togo. And those religious traditions, those practices that were brought primarily through slavery to the Caribbean and Latin America, intermixed in this really vibrant, fascinating way with Native American religions, with Christianity, especially Catholicism, to produce something that is understood to be Haitian Vodun. And that tradition uses all these different inspirations to create a kind of rich life world that was hugely important to slaves and freed Haitians and other people at the time, and was also a huge part of the 1791 rebellion that led to a freed Haiti.
So you mentioned 1791 just now. What time period are we talking about here for the development of what becomes known as Haitian Vodun?
Well, like anything else, it has a kind of a long history, but I would say that we're talking primarily about the 17th and 18th centuries, the 18th century probably mostly, but you have all these different ways where different moments things are connecting. So, slavery and the kind of large scale movement of people to the Caribbean, it has its early history, of course, in like the late 15th century, but really we're talking primarily for this development of Haitian Vodun, mostly from like the 18th century and some in the 17th.
Okay, so in the article you also mentioned that this Vodun is polytheistic. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because, I think that understanding the ways that we think about God or gods in any religion is also very fascinating.
Yeah, and this is where, the irritating answer that drives my students crazy, but they come to embrace by the end of the class. It makes me so proud is Vodun or voodoo, depending on how we talk about it, is it polytheistic? Well, it depends. So what does polytheistic normally mean? It typically means, belief in or veneration of or practices related to multiple gods, multiple spirits, something of that sort. So automatically we start in a way with this contrast to monotheism, which usually then gets us thinking about Christianity, right? Or the big three monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc. And I think we kind of already want to take a step away from that because even though obviously human brains are comparative, that's how we do everything. Polytheism often ends up looking problematic or less good or less real or, whatever in comparison to monotheism. So really, and actually, I think if you Google and you see something like, is voodoo polytheistic? A lot of people make this argument. Well, it's not really polytheistic because there is belief in one major god. And depending on how we make these definitions, that's true, or could be true, or could be, accurate, however you want to say it. There is this sort of distanced creator being with whom practitioners have very little to no actual interaction. But then there are all these, depending on how you frame it, right, gods, spirits, etc., called lua, who are really the ones who are actively engaged with human life, who interfere, who help, who bless, who complicate, who possess. And so in that respect, depending on who you ask, maybe you would say it's monotheistic with some spirits. Maybe you would say it's polytheistic. I would say I would leave that up to the individual scholar, but I tend to lean toward polytheistic because I think monotheistic gives a sense of like just the one dude up there telling people what to do.
Nice. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about practices as well. So when we think about Vodun, and we think about any religion, people do certain things within religion. However they tend to express themselves within a certain tradition. It's interesting to observe, to think about, to talk about. So you mentioned that Vodun is a very communal religion and also very performative. And I'm curious what each of these look like and what people are doing and expressing in these communal and performative ways.
Yeah. So one of the things that I also, now we're back to the notion of comparison. I feel like this is what religious studies scholars do, or probably all scholars do, right? Anytime we try to make one firm statement, you're like, well, actually, here are all these ways, the proliferation of our minds. Practices are hugely important. And when I wrote this in the article, one of the points I was trying to make is that when you ask the question, is voodoo a religion? Or then we expand, is Vodun a religion? Is Vodun a religion, et cetera? Almost always, the people asking this question, or in the way I frame the article, it's being asked from a kind of American, typically white Protestant perspective. Is Vodun a religion? What they mean is, does it look like my thing? Mm-hmm. Or does it look like something I know when I say religion? And so often what people mean when they say that is something like it's private, it's personal, it's internal. And you contrast that with all kinds of things we may or may not call religions that aren't necessarily private. They're not necessarily communal or personal. Rather, they're public and they're communal. They're not necessarily about what you believe, but more about what you do, or the hierarchy between belief and practice might look different. And so for this one, for Voodoo or Vodun, there is a lot of activity, physical activity, singing, dancing, sacrificing, praying, etc., making offerings that might look very different and very strange from a perspective if religion to you is something that's internal, that's really just about what you yourself alone believe in connection to some one single higher power. So there are all kinds of practices. And again, depending on your perspective, that you might say something like are beautiful and are exciting and are fascinating or dangerous or scary. And I think I've probably done enough work at this point to hit on why dangerous and scary are problematic and beautiful too, right? They're all kind of predicated upon an assumption of difference. But so this sort of the emphasis on practices was in part to say, like, look, this is something different from how we might use the term religion, but that people get together and dance and sing and sacrifice, etc. And that's meaningful and important to them.
When you say sing, what are they singing about?
All kinds of things. I think it depends on what they're doing at the time. So sometimes songs are about inviting spirits to come out, or gods. Again, most people use the language spirits, use the term spirits, inviting the Loa to come be with them, be amongst them, be inside them, or possess them. The term possess too has a kind of negative connotation, but yeah.
Are there any like authentic recordings of some of these songs?
Yeah, sure. So there are all kinds of recordings like that people make right now, like might be making in this very moment on their cell phones of themselves, as part of a celebration or some kind of interaction. There are all kinds of recordings and documentations. There are documentaries from the 1950s. There's a documentary by this French, I think she's a sociologist, Maya Deren, who is, kind of making this first real, like, Western glimpse into, like, documentary glimpse into Haitian Vodun. But yeah, I mean, you can Google and you will see people recording. Actually, I think there's, I think Reza Aslan might have done a piece on, quote, voodoo in Haiti for CNN.
Oh, was it in the Believer series?
Probably, yeah. Which alone is, I will just say, undiplomatically, a very irritating title. Because why does it have to be about belief, right? Well, it's about why we define religion the way we do.
Interesting.
Yes, I think it might have been part of that. And, there are scenes there of, CNN's cameras capturing people doing stuff. Now, whether or not we would call that authentic, we have to problematize what authentic means and blah, 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 right? We won't do that now. But certainly there are recordings, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so whenever we think about singing, dancing, sacrificing, things like that, the term that springs to mind also appears in your pieces, ecstatic. And I'm curious, what does the term ecstatic mean within Vodun? And then I'm also curious about how American religious traditions are inspired by the ecstatic expression found within Vodun.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure how much there would be a direct inspiration from, Haiti to the U.S. Broadly to the U.S., right?
Yeah.
We didn't talk about this, but, there's this continuation of like West Africa to the Caribbean to the United States, especially to the southern United States, with this tradition that, goes Vodun, voodoo, maybe hoodoo, whatever, right? All these different ways of talking about it. So I don't know necessarily how much the ecstatic in a literal way might translate, but there's no doubt that ecstasy is part of all kinds of traditions we might call religions. And I think in this sense, it means something sort of like, there are all kinds of ways to talk about it, maybe. maybe it's just about like this feeling of, joy or energy or something of that sort. And you may go as far as something like a break with yourself or distance from your own self or engagement with a new self that only appears at this time, something like a radical kind of pleasure or disjuncture. So in this sense with Vodun, I think it's often really about inviting engagement with the spirits, and that ecstasy comes in part from the presence and engagement with the Loa, and especially probably with possession, or with having the Loa enter you, ride you is the term that's often used, but be part of your physical, mental, epistemological self. And so that's a very different kind of way of being.
What's the term you keep saying? Is it Loa?
Yes, sorry, I could have explained that earlier.
Yeah, what is that?
So LOA or LWA, depending on how you spell it, it comes out of a Fon word from Benin that means spirits. And so that's the term. Sometimes in English, people often say spirits, but they might say Loa or it depends on how you say it. Loa, Loa. I'm pretty sure Reza Aslan says like Loa.
Okay, so I'm curious about symbolism a little bit as well. What symbols are found within Vodun, and what should we look for if we're, observing it?
There are all kinds of symbols, like agricultural symbols, symbols of like, bodies, climatological things, all kinds of stuff. In the same way that like probably most anything has, there are images that are important. So the way, you might see things represented is also a way of cueing like relationships to certain spirits or, things like that.
Okay, so whenever we think about the deities or God or gods in the world, a lot of times, oftentimes, people think about God as something that is morally perfect or something like that. And in the piece, you write that deities in Vodun are understood to be morally ambiguous, which might be a contrast for some people whenever they're thinking about how they view religion. So who are some Vodun deities, and how are they understood to be morally ambiguous?
This is very fun to talk about, I think. I think there's a way in which many traditions that come out of Africa and the African diaspora have this rich conception of what it means to be a person and also what it means to be a spirit or a god or a deity, again, depending on the terms people might use. And it isn't this kind of all-seeing, all-perfect, removed being necessarily, but instead you get spirits who are hungry and who are desirous and who, want to eat chocolate and want to dance and want to live as human beings or want to have nice coats or, want to make you fall in love with someone or help you fall in love with someone. And so you get, in a way, these very human impulses that I think for a lot of people are like really resonate and help them kind of see themselves. And, there is all kind of scholarship about practice throughout Africa and throughout, the Caribbean and Latin America and the US, where we see this kind of fragility and beauty and desire in the spirits that humans also have. So there are a number of different kinds of deities or different deities, and they have, depending on what kind of Vodun we're talking about. So is this Haiti or Jamaica or the Dominican Republic or the US? Things might differ and the terminology differs a little bit, but I'm trying to think of ones that might be the most recognizable to people. Papa Legba might be one. He is sort of associated with crossroads and the sense of sort of intermediacy or being intermediary maybe between the human world and the spirit world. Trying to think of who else we might talk about. He often appears as an older man. He often wears a kind of hat. In a lot of depictions of him, he has a hat. And so back to the symbols, you might see a straw hat hanging somewhere. His hat is usually made of straw. And so you might see that hat hanging somewhere or a drawing of that hat that often is cueing like, oh, I have a personal relationship with Papa Legba, or he's the, Loa with whom I most resonate or something like that. He walks with a cane.
Well,
often dog.
And also, like with Papa Legba, I believe that Lance Reddick depicted him in American Horror Story, right?
Really? I don't know, actually. I've only seen like the early American Horror Stories, and I got a little creeped out. So
I think there's a season with Lance Reddick who played, who was in The Wire. He was like the sergeant in The Wire. But I believe that there's a season of American Horror Story where Lance Reddick depicts Papa Legba. So you might want to check that out as far as like your film interests go.
Yeah, look how useful this has been already.
Absolutely. Okay, so the title of the article is Voodoo a Religion? So to me, when I'm hearing you describe Vodun, it feels like it fits all the criteria of being classified as a religion. There's beliefs, there's practices, there's deities, there's things people do. In fact, you describe these practices as rational forms of engagement with the spirit realm for practitioners. So I'm curious if you've seen any of these practices in person or interviewed people describing their experiences to you and what those conversations may have been like.
Well, I've never seen Haitian Voodoo in particular in practice. I have talked with some practitioners very informally, so I've never formally interviewed them because my work on the African diaspora is really about contemporary, Pentecostal Christianity in the U.S. My formal interviews are really focused on that stuff. I've attended some services that come out, or basically like practices of people from Benin and Nigeria in the U.S. That are, sort of part of this antecedent religious culture. But yeah, I mean, I would say it's interesting because there are all kinds of ways, even though, I haven't seen this stuff in person and, maybe never will, for lots of good reasons, probably. I do think that there's an interesting way of thinking about classify is what you said. And I think that's exactly the thing that I'm interested in ultimately in my work. Can this be classified as a religion or not? Why or why not? And ultimately, what does it mean to do so? And so, yeah, there are all kinds of ways that we might define this as a religion. And I certainly would. And that's what the article argues. I would classify it as a religion, but everyone else gets to make that decision for themselves. And on what criteria are they making that classification and, to what ideological ends? So even though I haven't seen, this particular stuff I'm talking about in the article in person, I would still say, I would classify it as a religion.
Excellent. Well, in the piece, you also refer to quite a few films. So I want to go back to Hollywood for a second. So you talk about Angel Heart, The Princess and the Frog, Skeleton Key, Major League, Bayou. So as a scholar interested in the depictions of African diasporic depictions in major films and pop culture, can you tell me a little bit about your process for finding film depictions and tell me about your research process in finding what we see on our TV screens and movie screens over the years?
Sure. Well, the good thing about this, kind of question is that a lot of people have done research already. And so I'm not starting from scratch. There's no way in which I'm trying to figure out, having to watch 100 movies.
Right.
So part of it is from, not that would be bad because it sounds great. Part of it, of course, is just from, looking at what other people have written and then following up on their points. So I cited this article in the Is Voodoo a Religion article. Joseph Murphy writes an article called Black Religion and Black Magic, Prejudice and Protection and Images of African-Derived Religions. And he mentions a number of these movies also, and a lot more that I didn't talk about. So in part, it's about, reading closely this really brilliant work that other people have done and saying, oh, yeah, let me follow that and check it out. And then also it's in part just watching movies myself or seeing things and picking up on them or having other scholars talk to me about them or friends saying, hey, I think you might, just like you did, you should look at, American Horror Story and being like, great. This, I think, is kind of the remarkable thing about academia. It gets a lot of, academia gets a lot of trash talked about it for good and bad reasons. But I do think the kind of network we have where people might know what you're interested in or the questions you're asking, and so much stuff, gets sent to you. So, I found out about them from suggestions from people, from other people's work, and just sometimes by accident or from that tingling sensation you get, which sounds very strange. But as a scholar, when something is going to be, even you see a 3-second trailer and you're like, hold on a second. I need to follow that up because something's going to come up that's going to be important.
Nice. Well, and I'm curious, like, how scholars go about fact checking when they find a film that has a depiction of voodoo or voodoo of some kind. Mm-hmm. What is the process like for determining the accuracy of the depiction?
I will say that might be something, the in-depth answer to this question would probably be something better given to someone else, in part because I'm not a specialist. But what I would say, what I do, and what really interests me kind of generally in the study of religion is trying to figure out, rather than trying to judge necessarily accuracy, like, is this faithful to some insider depiction? Is this faithful to some historical depiction, whatever, and really trying to figure out what is the ideological goal in the depiction, what's the gaze we're getting, and what's trying to be done here. And I would say any depiction, like many listed, in the article, that is trying to make an ideological point about difference and strangeness and danger, itself is problematic. And so whether or not it's accurate, I would probably say I would take a step back from, because I'm not steeped in the deep, historical facts about Vodun. But certainly the, skeleton key, angel heart may be the most amongst them. But those, movies really are about creating this sense of like fear and exotica and, magic, etc. And I mean, Angel Heart's the perfect example. If you think about, it's this, completely convoluted and ridiculous story, but you have this, white man who is literally peering through, some bushes at this young, beautiful woman. He has developed an interest in watching her do these practices. And it's bloody and it's sexy and it's dirty in a way, like literal dirt, sand. And I think that scholars alone, we're keyed to that kind of thing, right? We know that that's doing a lot more, whether it knows it or not, than just showing us some image.
Well, one of the examples that really jumped out at me as well is the movie Major League with Charlie Sheen. So I was like obsessed with that movie when I was in middle school and high school. And one of the things that jumps out at me when I was reading your article was the depictions of Pedro Serrano, the home run hitter allegedly on the team, and in the locker room, how all these like middle-aged, out of shape, failed major leaguers are like peering over at what Pedro is up to, like side-eyeing Pedro big time. So he's sitting at his locker, involving his cursed doll, Joe Boo, and who has a penchant for cigars. What do you know about Pedro in Major League, and how does this depiction sort of like fit in with like this exoticism or with this othering that you're kind of referring to?
Yeah, so I haven't seen that movie in a while, so I'm thinking back to it now. But my memory is that in part it is about your depiction is a really nice one. Like, you've got these kind of tired, white dudes with their hurt knees who are like, oh, no, one more season. And then, you have, this like home run hitter. And there's this notion that like he's getting his power from somewhere else, right? Like, his power doesn't just come from him. It doesn't come from himself, his own athletic prowess or whatever. And I think it's done in a very funny way. But there is this sense that like, this guy's got something else. And like, maybe we don't necessarily want that thing because maybe it's dangerous, even though it's funny, right? But there is this way in which like there's power coming from something and somewhere else. And maybe it's illicit power, and maybe it's humorous illicit power. But my memory is that, like, as much as it's kind of creating a caricature of, a spirit that wants something, or in this case, like it being called a curse doll. It's like, well, the voodoo doll alone is, this, symbol that doesn't hold the same kind of significance or relevance for most actual practitioners as it does for an assumption from, an American perspective. So that alone, people will be like, yeah, no, not so much probably. But the cigars thing, there are Luas who love cigars.
Awesome. So, I think that building bridges and understanding between people who practice different religions is such a good thing in our world. But I would imagine that that broader understanding of the history of Vodun or voodoo based on film depictions has not really increased our cultural literacy with regards to practices, because the films probably depict these things as still odd and exotic. Is there any broad understanding or misunderstanding about voodoo that you think that our society struggles with based on the caricatures presented in films?
Yes, I would say all of them. I think the idea here really is creating an image that's exotic. And it might be compelling in its exotic nature, but it's certainly not given the same kind of credence or legitimacy as, someone praying in a Southern Baptist church or someone, working a rosary. And so I think there are all kinds of ways in which these movies don't contribute to a richer understanding. Instead, they really present a very similar picture to one another that is based, as we talked about a little bit earlier, on this historical account that again comes from white missionaries or white colonialists looking at these practices and going, whoa, weird, scary, bad, and attaching that to all kinds of narratives about slaves and about Africans and about African Americans. And so, I think the movies have not helped at all. And certainly when I talk about these things in my classes, my students have a very similar, 3-point perspective, which is voodoo dolls. One time I went to New Orleans, magic, and that's not because they aren't thinking critical people. It's because they've been given this sense repeatedly. And there's really no reason for them to question it until they're invited to at some moment.
So this isn't, you've mentioned a few times that voodoo and vodun isn't necessarily your specialty, but I'm also curious about your agenda for research within the field, because you're obviously deeply interested in this. But what are your research plans? What is your agenda as far as the next several years of scholarship goes?
Well, first on my agenda is to finish my interminable dissertation. So as soon as possible, finishing it. And then I have a number of things I'm working on right now. Russell McCutcheon, the chair of the department where I work, and I are publishing a book about things people have written about J.T. Smith wrote about him in the year since he died. So between sort of December 2017 and December 2018. So we collected together a bunch of writings about that. And most of my work is really focused on the idea of gendered religious personhood, especially religious womanhood. And so in my dissertation and in some articles I'm working on now, a lot of the questions I'm trying to think through are things like, how do we arrive at conclusions, or how do various groups arrive at conclusions about what it means to be a good Christian woman, or a good Christian mother, or things of that sort. And so those questions I'm trying to answer right now are with Nigerian Pentecostals in the U.S., but I'm also interested in that question in kind of American evangelical circles. What else am I doing? I'm working on a website about teaching, a kind of web resource about teaching for the department here. I'm asking people to share examples that they've used in their teaching that have been productive, in part so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So you can go and look and say, all right, I'm teaching about classification today, or I'm teaching about pilgrimage. What are some examples or exercises I can do instead of having to spend 3 hours trying to think through this stuff? And I have been working on an article for a book that Emily Clark and Rachel McBride are editing about digital humanities and material religion. So there's so much awesome stuff going on. I'm actually trying to say no to things. Those are some of the big things I've been working on.
Well, I appreciate you not saying no to me, because this is awesome. Where can people find you if they want to follow you and see what you put out next?
Well, I am intermittently active on Twitter. So I actually probably don't link my stuff to my work very often. And I'm not sure why. I think it's more about like, oh, is it awkward to say, read this thing I wrote? I'm going to have to get over that. But I'm on Twitter and I chat with a lot of people there. I have like a faculty page on the UA website where I have some links to some of the stuff I've written. I'm on academia.edu, although I'm one of those lame people who never post anything. So this conversation alone has inspired me maybe to do a little better job of, putting things there. But those are probably the best places to reach me. And I would never say no to this podcast because I use it in my teaching. So I was honored to be asked.
Why did you use it in your teaching? I'm just curious.
Well, I've really been trying to think, going back to the idea of like being young, trying to think about how to really broaden the kinds of data and resources I use in my teaching. And so most of what I use, I use some texts that are about religious studies proper, but then a lot of the examples I use don't come from religious studies per se. Instead, they come from like, I ask students to talk about love or to watch a movie, or we play like board games or whatever, in an effort to make a connection between their lives and the material. And so that also applies to like types of methods or, technology or whatever. And so a lot of them listen to podcasts. And I thought this would be a really cool way to get them thinking about some questions and get them introduced to certain scholars who might be using methods or talking about issues that we've talked about. But that isn't just saying, here's an article, here's another article, here's a book. And they have loved listening to them. They love podcasts, even though at first they're like, they, affectionately tend to make fun of me, like, ooh, you think you're being cool, podcasts. But normally they're actually pretty happy to have used them in the end.
Besides this one, what are some other podcasts that you recommend to undergraduates?
I have some of them I've given them to listen to, in just like one-offs to listen to interviews with people. So now I'm trying to think about what they've listened to. Well, they've listened to UA's podcast.
Study Religion, right?
Yes. I think it's just called Study Religion Podcast.
Yeah.
I have had them listen to, I can't remember, it's called Myth Makers. There's one about myth, and the Lore Podcast, some things like that. What are some of the other ones? I should have made a note before we had this conversation. But we've covered a few of those. I've had them listen to some stuff that Kelly Baker has done.
Yep.
And I know you just interviewed her recently. A number of people we sort of try to pick up on. And Twitter, again, is great for this because there are all kinds of things that I've never listened to that I wouldn't know about. Yeah. I had to also listen to The Lonely Palette, which is an art podcast.
Oh, cool.
And used it as a way to talk about, we were talking about Georgia O'Keeffe and, gender and the way it's conceived. And so things of that sort. So they listened to that.
Nice. Well, another one I'm super into right now, I'm going to do a few of them. I'm into Bradley Onishi's podcast.
Oh, yes. Straight White American Jesus.
So good. And I'm also into Keeping It 101 with Elise Morgenstein first and Megan Goodwin. Like, those are just wonderful as well. So I love those. But yeah, so Emily Cruz, I'm absolutely delighted to have you on Classical Ideas. I'm so glad that we were finally able to make this happen and get our universes to connect on this rainy Sunday afternoon it's rainy for me. It's probably not rainy for you, is it?
It's very sunny in Tuscaloosa today.
Nice. Well, it's rainy in Buffalo and it's sunny in Tuscaloosa. So on that note, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com. Or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.